you got into media, which very fortuitous. I mean, media has just exploded in ways that you probably couldn't foresee back in the day. I mean, before the internet, really. I mean, it's just the evolution of where we get our content and the impact that it has on us. It's I'd love to unpack your thoughts on what's going on currently a little bit later. But so you moved out to LA, or were you on the West Coast for this job?
Yes, I did. I did my first 5 years out there, came back to Chicago for a stint, and then I ended up in New York. It was a time where the three big networks kind of dominated media consumption, and people had to make an appointment to watch the programming they wanted. They wanted to get their daily news. They had to go watch when it was available, a couple, 3 times a day, and that was it. They wanted their entertainment programs. They had to make an appointment. Pretty soon, technology started rearing its head, and you had recorders, right? You had the ability to put a cassette recorder in and tape a show so you could watch it when you wanted. And then really, the advent of technology kept coming, and technology eventually made it easy to record your programming right on your set top box. And then more programming outlets started proliferating. Actually, the ESPN was one of the early cable frontiers and came in quietly with a different business model. It wasn't reliant on advertising like we were. It was reliant on subscription fees from people who were starting to buy cable. And obviously there was fewer limits on cable station capability. So, there might have been in any given market, 5, 6, 7 TV stations, but soon there was 10, 20, 100, 400 cable channels. And this was all before the internet started rearing, popping, and which became another media platform. But as we all recall, our first experience with it was more of a dial-up to communicate with people in chat rooms, and the bandwidth just didn't allow content to be transferred in any reasonable time. Right? There just wasn't enough capacity at that time. So all of this happened, I'd say, through the 80s. And by the time we're in the 90s, you just can see a different landscape developing, a media landscape. So in big summary, you have technology, which started immediately changing consumer behavior. And consumers started, instead of having to make an appointment, they were having their own programming to themselves. That was a big deal. When I started, the business model between networks and television stations were, we'll give you our network programming station, and thank you for airing it, so we'll give you some money.
Right.
And then at some point, the demand started shifting, and then the network said, hey, TV station, we're going to give you that programming, but we can't afford to give you money anymore. It's too expensive to make programming, and it's getting competitive.
So are you saying the content creators were paying to have their content put on the television stations?
Yes.
And the networks, so the television stations were, my wife was in media. She worked for like Trumper Communications. And then over the course of maybe in Charlotte, and then maybe over the course of 10 years, I think it was bought by somebody else, then ultimately gobbled up by Clear Channel. Yeah. So what you're saying is, and also pick this up from the Bob. Who's the guy that did the Happy Little Paintings? Bob Ross. So it's Bob Ross. I also picked this up from the Bob Ross documentary. So, but it was, most of these television stations were locally owned and operated. So they had control of the airwaves. Is that correct?
It's true. Thousands in the country, and the networks each owned a few of their own, give it 5, 10 or 15 in each market, the big markets, because they wanted to have some access to programming locally as well. So they always had a relationship between networks and then owning some stations. But you're right. That was the relationship back then with networks and stations and how programming got disseminated.
Yeah, and I've met several people that we've had in our Homefront Brands franchise owned radio stations in the Triad area, Raleigh Durham area. That's what their family did for 30
Yeah,
or 40 years. And of course, they got an offer they couldn't refuse. The local family business that owned the radio station here and the television stations, and so really interesting that access was what had value inside of that versus the content, where now it's really shifted to where content is king and it finds every avenue possible. And you can get it there's so many ways to get content and new ways coming out every day. I can only imagine that they have, and we've seen the impact in the newspaper industry. We've seen the impact in network television. We've seen the impact in ESPN, where an upstart like Barstool Sports can come out and just absolutely crush.
yeah, it's such an amazing sea change when you think about what it was and what it is, and where it's still headed. Because audience fragmentation and choice is still, I think, expanding sideways. And
Who'd
again,
you work for in New York? In New York, who'd you work for?
I worked for
NBC?
ABC, the network,
Okay.
and then another time I worked for Tribune Media. When I worked for ABC in the 1986, that was the first media acquisition of any size and any notable nature. A small company called Capital Cities came in and borrowed a few $1 billion from Warren Buffett, and they bought ABC for $3.5 billion. 1986, and I believe they sold it to Disney 10 years later for $18.7 billion. So once Warren Buffett had some vision and made a good investment there. But
Yeah, you think I think now it might not be popular, but I think Warren Buffett one day will be very successful.
you think?
I think.
Well, the success is relative, Dan. I mean, Jeff,
I wish he was my relative.
I think I do too. Although he doesn't give a lot of money to his relatives, remember?
Why would he? You'll ruin him forever.
That's what he said. But you brought up Trumper. So I just had a communication with Jeff Trump. I mean, some of the pioneers in this business are, they're still around. And when we reflect on what was and what is, it's mind blowing.